We're delighted to, have an event co-sponsored by the ACMCU and the Rumi Forum, where I will be going later today for my Turkish class with the distinguished teacher Kenan Bey. I don't know if he's here or not, but anyway, it's a wonderful institute. It's downtown, and if you ever want to learn Turkish, and if you have a job or taking classes like me, then it's a great place because you have class once a week. It's a perfect schedule for a working person who wants to learn Turkish, and very nice teachers. And they make you tea, actually, in the break between each, in the middle of the class. It's a very Turkish atmosphere. We're delighted to have Dr. Tarik Quadir here to speak about diversity as a mercy from God, Rumi's teachings in the Quran. Dr. Quadir is a Bangladeshi-American who studied Sufism, Islamic Philosophy, and Perennial Philosophy, as well as Islamic Environmentalism with the renowned Islamic philosopher, Dr. Seyyed Hossein Nasr. Dr. Seyyed Hossein Nasr teaches at George Washington University. Dr. Quadir received an MA in Islamic Studies from George Washington University, followed by an MA in Indo-Muslim Culture from Harvard University. It was his love for Mawlana Jalaluddin Rumi, the famous 13th century poet, that first led him to Konya in 1998. And after receiving a PhD from the University of Birmingham on the subject of Islamic response to the environmental crisis, he moved to Konya, which is in south-central Turkey, where he now works at the Rumi Research Center at Mevlana University. So without further ado, we will all benefit from his presentation. Thank you very much.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In the name of God, most gracious and most merciful. First of all, I want to thank Prince Al-Walid bin Talal, Muslim Christian Understanding, Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, for inviting me. And thanks to all of you for coming. I hope your time will be worth it. What I wish to discuss today is how we, the people of this planet and the creatures, would like to live in future. The vision, from an Islamic perspective at least, of how we might live peacefully with each other in this planet, and even learn from our differences. And I hope, even if I don't convince you, you will notice that this approach is a bit different from what was proposed by the September 11 hijackers and even what happened today in Libya. Now, before I start speaking on diversity and how it is a mercy, I want to first remind you what Rumi reminds us very often, and what I think is fundamental and or ultimate for Rumi and Islam. That is the forgotten human reality. He tells us again and again that we are made in the image of God. Whatever appears within Adam is God's reflection, like the moon in a stream. And it's, of course, almost like a paraphrase of what the Prophet said, that man is made in the image of God. Now, if we understand what the purpose is, the purpose of creation is, then we'll see how diversity is a mercy from God. So, before I talk, I want to start the talk on diversity with mentioning the purpose of creation from a Rumi's point of view, and I might say from the Quranic point of view as well. God said to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, I was a hidden treasure, I love to be known, hence I created the world in order that I might be known. This is not very complicated actually, not too mysterious. Any of us, whatever we do, speak, say, create, we are revealing ourselves. You are a painter. You paint something. Even if I don't know you, I look at the painting, I have some idea about you. You're a carpenter, whatever, Whatever we make, we reveal ourselves. So God is doing essentially the same thing, exactly the same thing. But there's a difference between our creativity, what we leave on things we make, and what God does. Because what we do is bring together things of the world and creatively put together. But in God's case, everything comes from God. He doesn't go buy things and put together. Everything comes from God. So everything in nature reflects who God is. So this is the fundamental idea, fundamental understanding in Islam about God's relationship to the diversity in the universe, God's relationship to the creation at large. Now, the Quran refers to this in terms of signs of God. Everything is a sign of God, the Quran says. What is a sign of God? When a sign of anything, it says something about that thing and points to that thing, a deeper reality of that thing. So, the whole universe is a sign of God. And it is not to be understood equally by everybody. Those who are wiser understand it better. And from an Islamic point of view, the wiser is the one whose heart is covered less and less by ego characteristics, anger, hatred, envy, jealousy, and so forth. Ego characteristics. The clearer your heart is, the more you see. And Rumi summarizes this whole issue in these words. He does it in many other places, but I think here it's pretty clear. Consider the creatures as pure and limpid water within which shine the attributes of the Almighty. Their knowledge, their justice, their kindness, all are stars of heaven reflected in flowing water. Okay? Especially to Rumi, an awakened saint, the heart is pure, and to him, every one of us are like limpid water, and he sees through. So our kindness and other qualities are like stars of heaven reflect, meaning qualities of God being reflected. The same idea. So this is the relationship between God and the universe. The universe reflects, everything in the universe reflects the qualities of God. And the wiser you are, the more you see it. And the Quran obviously supports this. You see in verses in the Quran, things like, wherever you turn, there is the face of God. He is the first and the last, the outer and the inner. So why diversity? And how is it a mercy? We have seen God's relationship to the universe. Everything reflects God's qualities. But why and how is it a mercy? Rumi gives several reasons. First is this: the God being infinite, he cannot reveal himself just by one thing, just by creating me. Then there would be a pretty limited vision. So he created all of you, and the trees and the birds and the beasts and the sky and the earth and so forth, flowers. That's one. So the infinite one is constantly revealing himself through infinitely different types of creations. And the next is even more interesting. He says, we know each thing by contrasting it with other things. For instance, how do I know what an apple is? Because nothing in the world is quite like an apple. Okay? By contrasting things. And we know each thing best by knowing its opposite. So we know black by white. So at one place he says, if you write with a black ink on a black piece of paper, you can't see it. So the opposites, like he says here, the locus of manifestation for a thing is its opposite. And each opposite aids its own opposite in revealing it. Okay? Now, it's easy to, so far this logic is kind of mathematical. It's not so difficult to accept this. But it gets more complicated when you talk about good and evil. And I almost wish I didn't go into that subject, but I will have to at least give the basics. Now, before I do that, of course, I have to say that the Quran also points at this idea of how diversity helps in knowing God, knowing each thing. And as we know each thing, remember, we are knowing about God because God reveals himself through each of his creations. So you have verses like this in the Quran. And among his signs is the creation of the heavens and the earth and the diversity of your tongues and colors. So diversity itself is a sign. And what does a sign do? It reveals God. So diversity is a means of revealing God. The second verse is even more pointed. O mankind, truly we have created you, male and female, and have made you nations and tribes so that you may know each other. And commentators often point out, God didn't say, so we may stay away from each other, hide each other, shoot each other, or crash planes into each other's buildings. So to know each other. So it's almost a command for us to have a dialogue with the other. It could be religious, ethnic, racial, cultural, other. God wants us to know each other. Why? Because we are all creations of God, and by knowing each other, we become more aware of the glory of God. Okay. So now we come back to this subject, good and evil. As I said, I don't want to go into this, but I have to. First of all, Rumi said, why is there good and evil? I mean, what do we do with that? Is evil from God? The Rumi has several answers. First of all, he says, there is no absolute evil or absolute good in this world. If anything was absolutely good, it would be same as God. But if anything is absolutely evil, then it cannot exist. Because God is not evil. And if it's absolutely evil, everything depends for its existence, God. So nothing can possibly exist without God willing it in some sense. Okay? But at the same time, he tells us that good and evil are relative. What seems good to one may seem evil to another. Okay? For instance, you all heard of, most of us are pretty happy about, I'm not, but most of us are pretty happy about all the technological developments that have taken place in the last 200 years. We can grow more food, we have saved more lives, and so on and so forth. I've just traveled from Turkey. It would not be possible even 100 years ago. So in many ways, it has brought our loved ones together. Technology has made all these things possible, but at the same time, 98% of the scientists agree that our technological lifestyle has been responsible for the environmental crisis we face today. There are some disagreements, but most of them agree on this, 98%. So here you see, this is a very good, maybe not everybody agrees, but it's an example where you don't, from one perspective, good, another bad. So he has these two answers. And the third may be that good and evil, God is good, and by evil being out there, it reveals God. So Rumi says, God wills evil, but he does not approve of it. It's an interesting way of putting. God wills evil, but he doesn't approve of it. So for instance, I'm a teacher. I don't want all my students to know everything. I have to kind of demonstrate that I know some things better than them. So I don't approve of their ignorance. Okay, but I kind of wish that they don't come to the class knowing everything. So if there was no hunger, no disease, there was no calamity, nothing, how do we know that God is the provider, the healer, the merciful, and so forth? So this is one way of his reasoning. And the other is that through the trials and tribulations, by going through the trials and tribulations, we learn that within us are the qualities of God. Like, remember, we are made in the image of God. Unless we go through this, how would we own these qualities? How would we know that we indeed have it? When the calamities hit us first, when you're 18, we cry, you're annoyed, and so forth. And over the years, we learn slowly that, I can be patient, I can be loving, I can be tolerant, and so forth. And this kind of summarizes that perspective. If there were no bitter commands, beauty and ugliness, stones and pearls, if there were no Satan, ego, and self-will, and if there were no blows, battle, and war, then by what name would the king call his servants? How could he say, O patient man, O forbearing man? How could he say, "O brave man, O wise man"? Okay? And I'm going to leave this topic behind for the time being. So we discussed the diversity of creation and how it is a mercy, and then again, good and evil, and how that can also be a mercy, because all these things are there for God to reveal himself and for us to know God and our own qualities, the qualities of God hidden within us. Now I'm going to talk about religious diversity and what it means to Rumi first. And this kind of summarizes, but I have to tell the story behind it. In Masnavi, which is Rumi's most famous collection, there's a story where Prophet Moses, peace be upon him, comes across an illiterate shepherd. And he finds the shepherd adoring God, saying, "Oh God, I love you so much. I would like to comb your hair, wash your feet, bring you milk," and so forth. And Prophet Moses is aghast. "Oh my God, what is he doing?" He says, "What do you think God is? Is God your uncle? God is not your brother. He's this creator of this great universe, this limitless universe." And the shepherd is shocked. "Oh my God, this guy is a prophet. He knows. And I'm so ignorant." So he stops his adoration. He stands up and walks away. And at this point, God turns at Moses and rebukes him. And this is what God has to say. A revelation came to Moses from God. "You have parted my servants from me, my servant from me. Did you come as a prophet to unite, or did you come to separate? I have bestowed on everyone a special way of acting, and to everyone a form of expression. What is honey to one can be poison for another. I am independent of all purity and impurity. I did not ordain divine worship that I might make any profit. No, but that I might do a kindness to my servants. In the Hindus, the idiom of Hind is praiseworthy. In the Scythians, the idiom of Sindh. I look not at the tongue and the speech, I look at the state of the heart." So what you see here, first of all, God doesn't have any need. He does not need our worship. And he has given different ways of worship to different human communities to help them, and they are different, this is key, they are different, to help them find God, to reach out to God through that way. So what is good for the A group may not be good for the B group, and what is good for the B group may not be good for A group. And ultimately, what counts is the state of your heart. This is the key. Now, I'm sure you're also bright, you know this, but there are some people out there who think Sufis are good, but when it comes to real Muslims, they are something else. But I want to show you that actually Quran says exactly the same thing as what Rumi is saying. So I've quoted a few of the verses, not all of them. And probably most of you know this. I've called them inclusive verses because there are some which you might call exclusivist verses, which I'll come to it later. Inclusive verses. For every community, there has been a messenger from God. These are not interpretations, these are direct translations. Okay. Truly, those who believe, and the Jews and the Christians and the Sabians, so we have Jews and Christians, and whoever believes in God and the last day and performs virtuous deeds. If you think of last day to mean the accountability of your actions, then whoever believes in God and accountability, whatever you do, there is a consequence for that, and performs virtuous deeds, surely their reward is with their Lord, and no fear shall come upon them, neither shall they grieve. Okay? And this kind of summarizes the whole perspective. Again, another Quranic verse. And I want to point out, this verse was revealed almost towards the end of Prophet's life. It's not like in the beginning, which later people forgot. So it's like almost at the conclusion of all the revelations. For each we have appointed a law and a path. And if God had wished, he would have made you one people. But he has made you as you are. This is a theme that is repeated many, many times in the Quran. That if God wanted to make you one people, he could have done it, but he hasn't done that. So there is a purpose. He meant to have diversity in the world. Okay? But he has made you as you are, that he may put you to test in what he has given you. So vie with one another in good works. Unto God you'll be brought back, and he will then tell you about those things wherein you differed. So we may not understand it now, but either we, through spiritual practice, reach God, or after death, in either way, we're going to find out. Okay, why are there differences? But he's saying, if you don't understand, fine, but just do good works. Because as you do good works, you will come closer and closer to God. That's what's important. You'll clean your heart. And like what you saw Rumi say, and the Quran says, only he will be happy who comes before God with a heart free of evil. And this is also what the Prophet said. God only looks up in the quality of your heart. Okay. So, what you see, this does not mean that the Quran and Rumi does not criticize Jews and Christians. Well, I'm talking only about Jews and Christians because you don't see them mentioned, at least the Quran doesn't mention other religions, except you saw these small groups like Sabians, and nobody's quite sure who they were. They're probably followers of John the Baptist. That's one opinion, but it doesn't matter. So at least Jews and Christians. The Quran has almost no criticism of Judaism. There is one little criticism which doesn't apply anymore, so I will not get into that. But both Quran and Rumi criticizes Jews and Christians for their failure to recognize Prophet Muhammad as a prophet of God. That's one thing. They both criticize the concept of Trinity, if that means an ultimate reality, or if that in any way suggests that God is one of three. And they both categorically reject the idea of God being the Son of God, Jesus being the Son of God, if that means begetting, God begetting somebody in this human sense. Okay? So, but there is no real, there is a little criticism of monasticism, that monasticism is not something that Jesus taught. Okay? But there are no real criticism of Judaism and Christianity as far as laws, symbols, rituals, and so forth, unless they pertain to this, a perceived deviation from the unity of God, or the ultimate reality being one. This is very interesting. The criticism doesn't have to do with the form, but with the central message. Do they believe in one, or ultimately there is one, or not? Okay. So you see, forms are important to Rumi. I've quoted one verse. If the exposition of meanings were sufficient, the creation of the world would be vain and useless. If love for God were only thought and meaning, the form of fasting and prayer would not exist. So their emphasis is on the unity. But they want to say that, yes, but the forms are important. Forms is what distinguishes different paths. And they know that forms are different. Rumi says that grape wine is for Jesus' community, but this wine of union with the divine belongs to the community of the Quran. If there are vats of grape wine and vats of this, until you break the first, you will never taste of the second. So it's like this, in the first quote, I said, what is honey to one, maybe poison to other. So from a Rumist point of view again, and it's also a Quranic point of view, that what may be right for one community may not be right. But that doesn't mean Islam does not criticize Christians for drinking wine or eating pork. You don't see that in the Quran. It criticizes a perceived deviation from the unity of God. But it was important to know the essential message. And what is the essential message? The essential message of both Quran and Rumi is this, that the ultimate reality, essential message of all religions, the ultimate reality is one. In theological terms, God is one. And the ultimate purpose is submission to God. You might say purification of the heart. Both means the same thing, because God being absolutely good, if you submit, you will become pure. And the Quran says to that point, we never sent any messenger without the message that there is no deity save me, and therefore you shall worship me alone. Okay? Now, what is very interesting, that in spite of this criticism, some theological criticism which kind of separates us, there is a recognition that the Christians worship God. And these are like 2 verses, and there are others actually. If God had not enabled people to defend themselves against one another, monasteries and churches and synagogues and mosques in which God's name is abundantly extolled would surely have been destroyed. And mind you, these monasteries, even though the Quran criticizes monasticism and says this is not what Jesus taught, but there is a recognition that these are important, that God's names are celebrated, and God doesn't want it demolished. So in spite of the criticism, first of all, Rumi and the Quran does not criticize the form of the religions, as long as they don't pertain to the perceived deviation from that unity. Second, even if there is any criticism, there is still a recognition that they worship God. And that is our opening to the other, to the religious other. This is the key. And Rumi points to the same thing. In every religion, the ritual prayer is different, but faith does not change in any of them. Its inward states, its orientation, and so forth are all the same. So while we recognize that they are different, at the same time, we recognize that they ultimately worship God, and that is our bond with them. So far what I have discussed is, there is a diversity of religions, fine, and this is divinely willed, okay. So why is that a mercy? First, remember I said before that God, being the infinite one, he reveals himself through infinitely different types of creations. So you have many climatic conditions, cultures, geographical locations, languages, mental inclinations, and so forth. So if that is the case, and God wants everyone to know him as the one, he cannot just say the same thing to every group. He says little differently according to what suits that particular mindset, that particular culture. And this is what I believe the Quran is pointing to. And this is how Muslim scholars generally understand, actually. We sent no messenger except with a message in his own people's language, so that he might make the truth clear unto them. Okay? And language doesn't mean English, Spanish, but means of communication. Okay? That's one thing. So in this way, it's a mercy that the revelations are different, the religions are different. Second, I think one thing about difference of having a diversity of religions is this, that when you encounter great beauty in the other tradition, whether it's a wonderful Christian or a Hindu or a Muslim, from another tradition, or a saintly figure from that tradition, or a great piece of architecture, or maybe even painting, and you wonder what created this great beauty, that perhaps that my approach to God, my understanding of God, is not how God is limited. Maybe there are other ways. So through that curiosity, we might realize that, know more about the infinite nature of God. So again, it becomes a kind of a merciful thing, while the very diversity helps us to understand the infinite nature of God. Third, I think is quite interesting, and maybe not everybody is up for it. The Quran itself points at the same lesson in many different ways. And some people say, it's so repetitious. But because we forget, it goes over and over the same themes. It's coming from different angles. But you can think of religions that way as well. Let's say I'm a Muslim, when I study other religions, I see, they're pointing at the same things. They're pointing at the same things. Because we need to be reminded, one of the things the Quran says about human beings is that one of our natures is forgetfulness, probably the fundamental negative aspect of human beings, that we forget. Because we are told the right things and then we keep forgetting. But when we observe other religions, through that, we are reminded of the same things that Islam is teaching us, for Muslims. So here's another way the diversity can be merciful. It's reminding us of what we are supposed to do in different ways. Okay? So I've talked to you about why, how diversity is a mercy in general, and how religions can be also perceived as a mercy. At the end, I want to say, in Islam, only God is absolute. Only God is the absolute truth, not religions. So long as you commit yourself to a religious path with the goal of reaching God, wonderful. But religions are not absolute. They are paths to God. If there is a day of judgment, with the end of the day of judgment, there are no more religions, but we exist and God exists. So then it's between you and God, us and God. We are before God. Yes, because we live in a world of multiplicity, there cannot be two same religions. The religions has to be different because nothing in the universe is quite same as anything else. But the point is that at the root is one. And if we desire unity, we must anchor that effort in remembering the presence of God in the religious, ethnic, racial, cultural, biological, other. That's the only way. And in this connection, I want to quote with something that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said. And that's it. 1 second, let me see. Okay. He said it during the last pilgrimage to Mecca. O people, remember that your Lord is one. Your father Adam is one. An Arab is not superior over a non-Arab, nor a non-Arab superior over an Arab. Also, a white is not superior over a black, nor a black superior over a white, except by piety or God awareness. With that, I will end. Thank you so much for coming and for your time.
Thank you very much. We have plenty of time for question and answer and discussion. So I saw one hand here in the front. You want to ask first?
Thank you so much for wonderful. I already feel closer to God. Two issues. One, Rumi goes through his own stages, right? 7 stages or whatever one may say. But definitely there's a significant difference between the Masnavi and Diwan Shams al-Tabrizi, where Masnavi is more moral teachings, and of course the Moses story, there are elements that are preserved, but once he meets Shams, there's this madness that is not so much a mullah teaching about rules and that's really what I think is so interesting about Rumi, that period, that madness, that is so eternal. So the other thing is, this has to find some manifestation in reality. And in the Muslim world and in the Christian world, we have to look at, so what does it mean? And, it seems to me, God certainly hasn't blessed Saudi Arabia with this blessing, because Saudi Arabia is certainly not a hub of diversity. And in fact, if you say these things, they may call it blasphemy,
right?
Or somewhere behead you in the center of the city.
So I should not go to Saudi Arabia. No more Hajj for me.
Seriously advise against that.
No, but I have something to say about this. First of all, Diwan Shams Kabir, that was before Masnavi. And what may seem like madness to us is not really madness. And he had that feeling preserved. And in Masnavi, a lot of people say it's a commentary on the Quran. Abdur Rahman Jami, this great Sufi master, said the Quran, the Masnavi is Quran in Persian. But we don't have to say that, but at least a lot of people think it's a commentary. So Rumi was being careful, and I think at the beginning of Masnavi, he says, this is the root of the root of the root of our religion. So he's in a way commenting on a spiritual reality. Like one of my teachers said that, Dr. Seyyed Hossein Nasr says that Masnavi, when you read Masnavi, is like you're looking at yourself, you're discovering yourself. So of course, any teacher has to be in a different mode for teaching. Masnavi definitely didactic. He's trying to teach people step by step. So it's not exactly in opposition to what Diwan says, but it's a different approach.
I just wanted to add, to point out for anybody who might not know, the Masnavi and the Diwan Shamsuddin Tabrizi are the two big poetry works of Rumi, and they're each big. I mean, they are, at least the Masnavi is about this thick in Persian, and they're very, very long.
26,000 couplets.
But I would also add that it's important to remember that, and William Chittick makes this point very well, which is that when Shamsuddin Tabrizi, who's a sort of wandering dervish character, when he was asked about, would you rather sit with the dervishes or with the jurists, like the Muslim legal scholars, he said, I'd rather sit with the Muslim legal scholars because they actually have some formula they follow, and dervishes just kind of sit around and mumble and sensitive or something like that. So there's it's important to remember that the form and the meaning always go together in this tradition. Very important point, which you made very well. Thanks. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think the dilemma is, many people feel, country. Now in the contemporary world and through the ages, that beautiful verses like Mawlana Rumi's and the Quran seem to have an effect, influence only those who are receptive to it.
Mm-hmm.
But there is altogether another segment of the population which seem to be in. I mean, they seem to draw whatever they are doing, even as you mentioned today, for example, in Libya, they seem to draw some kind of conclusion which satisfy their own urges, which may be towards evil, violence, completely an opposite to diversity and tolerance.
What do we do in that situation, right? I mean, how do we get... Well, one thing is, for instance, the way Ibn Arabi has put it, that so long as you interpret a verse that makes sense linguistically, it has a reality. God is speaking. So if somebody says, okay, this verse means this or that, that has a reality. But that is not the only reality. We have to point out to these people that is not the only reality. There are other ways. First of all, if you go back to 17th century, you don't see all this kind of people in the Islamic world so much, but you see it now. So even though at that time the Quran was there are different mindsets, but it seems that nowadays you have more and more people who tend to see in this very exclusivist way. And the more we talk about these things, more we talk about the other side of the story, then hopefully they will be more and more marginalized. But I don't want to exclude them totally from the Muslim community. I think one of the conditions of inclusivity is that we include everyone and we have a dialogue. And if there were no exclusivists, how would I know what an inclusive is, what an inclusive person is? Just like if there are no many, how would I understand what unity is, So yes, there is a problem and we need to talk more about the beauty, about the unity, the fundamental unity. But at the same time, we should not shun out those people. Oh, Hamas, we're not going to talk to them. Or those people, get out. You're not Muslims. I think that's not a great attitude. Inclusive should be inclusive of everybody, and then have a discussion, exactly what you mean, and this is what we see. This is another way of understanding. Which one do you prefer? Which approach should we choose if we want to live peacefully in this world? We can't go to another planet, at least not in the foreseeable future. Yes, sir.
My sense of Rumi is that it's very much also about a love religion. It's a religion of love and a way of living into love.
Right.
And it isn't so legalistic. One of the first stories that touched me was the story of where he met Shams.
Mhm. Right.
And Rumi was a legalistic scholar. I can picture him a university professor in some ways.
Uh-huh.
He had written a treatise which had taken 20 years to write, like St. Augustine.
Right.
And Shams came. Shams is more like a street person. He's a madzu.
Mhm.
He's a darsh. And he takes this book that Rumi has taken 20 years to write, and he throws it in the well. Of course, it's only one copy.
Mhm.
And Rumi's students, picture in this room, they took the professor's book in the well, they get up and they're angry and they're enraged. But Rumi looks in Sham's eyes into this darvish, into this madman, and he sees something of the divine.
Mhm.
And Sham says to Rumi, if you like, I'll bring the book out of the well and every page will be dry. This is the whole treatise of who Rumi thinks he is and his belief in the world.
Mhm.
Rumi looks in his eyes and there's this moment of trust and love, I believe.
Mhm.
And he says, no, you can keep the book in the well. And Sham says, good, where we're going, it won't do you any good. And it's about the mysteries of love which shatter everything that you know. And shattering is so much a part of Rumi's teaching, it's the breaking down of forms. But also, I respect the other pole, which is like a bird flying, it comes back to its tree. And at a certain point, the trees are religions, you might take flight and actually go into this other realm. That's why it's dangerous. I think that the whole idea of Sufism and dervishhood hold a certain quality of danger and risk. But I think Rumi also says God loves those who gamble away themselves.
Yeah. Well, as far as Rumi's teachings are concerned, like Dr. Brown was saying earlier, in this path, and it's very clear in his writings, forms are important. He never says he wants to throw away the forms, but go beyond the forms. If you don't have forms, you can't go beyond them. And this story you mentioned, I don't know exactly where you picked up this story about Shams throwing a book Rumi wrote over 20 years. Rumi didn't write any book until after he met Shams, and they knew each other only for 3-4 years, physically at least. But whatever the truth is, but neither one of them actually talk about doing away with the forms. All the historians, including one of the greatest, Anne-Marie Schimmel and others, point at the fact that Rumi was very much a regular Muslim outwardly, but he had gone through the normative practices, gone deep down and realized, kind of touched God, connected with God. And that is their message, that the path is there to help you reach. And when you reach there, like reaching the top of a summit, you may not need the path anymore, but first you need the path to get there. Otherwise, how are you going to climb the mountain? You're going to take a step this way, that way. But I disagree. There are some people, especially in the West, who thinks Rumi and the Sufis have nothing to do with forms. There might be some Sufi groups who feels that. There are even non-Islamic Sufi groups now in America. I know. I mean, I'm aware of some of them. I've met them also. Sorry?
There's a tension between these two poles.
Within traditional Sufism, the way it has been practiced in Muslim the world for most of last 1400 years, there may be some tension. I mean, it's not easy to pray 5 times a day, but you will hardly find anybody who says, it's not right. Okay, they would not say, this is rubbish. I have become so enlightened, I don't need it. There is a story in Shams. You mentioned Shams as a street person, weird guy. But he knew the Quran very well. He knew the traditions of the Prophet very well. He was, one of the best biographies written by Franklin Lewis on Rumi. It says that he was a good jurist. He has a very good knowledge of jurists, like Dr. Brown was pointing out, that you said something about jurisprudence. Anyway, Shams was not a wild, crazy man, as people thought for a long time. Recent research shows that he was very much aware of these different traditions. And he was asked, do those who have reached a certain level, do they still have to pray, for instance, the ritual prayer, the salat? And he said, did the Prophet pray? And the people said, yes. So do you think you are more mature, more spiritual than he is? That was his answer, you know. So they prayed. Shams, Rumi, they all prayed. If you look into their history, not just popular novels, even popular novel like, you know, Elif Shafak's shows them doing salat. Yeah. There is a tension, but
There's also a shattering of forms too.
well, you go beyond forms.
Well, at times but there's at times
Okay. It's not exactly shattering, but beyond.
It's more like transcending. That's the whole. But
But you need the form to transcend the form. That is their
I
idea.
agree with you.
Yeah.
But there are verses that show. I mean, when he says, you know, those who have gone to Hajj,
Right.
where are you going? Come back. The beloved is the next door neighbor.
Right.
So it's you can do that and it's worthwhile, but you can also transcend it, and that's a whole different way, you know, of
Right.
reaching the same place. Maybe.
But his approach is following the tradition, no doubt about it. His approach is following the tradition with depth, and he will reach that divine from which you will understand the differences. Exactly what the Quran says. Actually, in the Diwan, which you said, or somebody you said, there's crazy madman. In the Diwan, I think the Rubayat, or Ghazal number 133, he says, I am the servant of the Quran. I am a servant of the Quran and a speck of dust on the path of Muhammad the chosen. If anybody says otherwise, they are misled, so forth. And I see that again and again. And you know, there are like 6,000 verses of Rumi that are almost paraphrase of Quran or some well-known hadiths. Yes.
I wonder if we could explore a little bit the idea of sealed of the prophets
Mhm.
vis-a-vis these other languages and cultures, and each nation their own prophet, and any narrative point you want to take, the Masnavi,
Right,
and so
right.
forth. Well, for instance, an example, I go to Pakistan from
Mhm.
time to time,
Right.
and I have friends that are Deobandi scholars, and they are very much enamored now of the Asian heritage of India.
Mhm.
And they are particularly fond of Ramanuja, who was
Mhm.
a great Hindu theologian,
Right.
propounded Vishishtaadvaita, probably 300 or 400 years after the Prophet lived. How is he to be considered in any framework you want to use?
Someone like Ramanuja?
Yeah, but it's a good example.
Huh. Well, I think Ramanuja was not exactly saying anything new. I mean, he was commenting on the Hindu tradition.
Right.
And same with Shankara and others who are also after the Prophet. And what Shankara said, for instance, he was a great saint, and he's talked about Advaita philosophy, which you might, it comes very close to Wahdatul Wujud, the oneness of being. But when you talk about seal of the prophets, we don't talk about seal of the saints. Seal of the prophet means somebody who brings a whole major way to God. And the prophets and saints in each tradition as followers of the path, followers of the prophet. So within the Islamic tradition, the saints who came after that, such as Rumi, they took the prophet as the model. And in Hinduism, whether it's whoever came, they're following the older examples. And so we might say Ramanujan and Shankaracharya, they were saints. They didn't create a whole new path that others Hindus began to follow, but this was like one interpretation of what came before. Yes.
Thank you, first of all. I wonder if I could ask a question that's a little less theological.
Ask whatever question you
Sure.
want.
Yeah.
The benefit of being high.
You can ask what I ate.
I was wondering how we can apply this idea of diversity, God's message through diversity, to intercultural diplomacy and addressing current environmental concerns, which you
Mhm.
mentioned that.
Yeah, right. Of course, sorry, did you finish?
And how this can help enlighten us and maybe guide us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, first, I think, people complain about Islamophobia, and my approach to this is, yes, there might be Islamophobia, but if we show greater respect for the quote-unquote, non-Islamic religions, there will be a response, a positive response from the non-Islamic world. That's number one. Second, you talked about environmental crisis. Actually, my doctoral thesis was on Islamic environmentalism. Yeah, I mean, and just like Christian environmentalism, we believe in the stewardship, that we are like God's representative on earth, and our job is to be the steward of the earth. That's one thing. But more fundamentally, something that Dr. Seyyed Hossein Nasr points out, and my doctoral thesis was about his approach, is that we have to change our worldview, how we look at the world. Today's worldview is dominated by modern scientific ways, modern scientific worldview. How we look at the world. When I look out there, I see a tree, the material aspects of it very often. I no longer see as a reflection of heaven, the garden in heaven, and so forth. I don't see the qualities of God. I'm thinking, oh, this tree is good. This wood would make a good furniture in my home. So our approach, our worldview has become very materialistic. I'm not saying everybody, maybe you are not, but at large, the world out there do not anymore live with a magical sense of the universe, which was there until 17th, 18th century. It's not just in the Islamic world, it was also in the Christian world, Hindu world, Islamic, Buddhist, everybody. And people like him, and I agree with them, that we need to, yes, there are various solutions we can have, but these are all cosmetic solutions. We can go back to simpler technologies, and we can maybe cut down emissions and so forth, but eventually what we have to get to is to revive this religious worldview in the sense that we have to relearn to see the universe as containing the signs of God, or vestigia Dei in the Latin, I think, same idea. Without that, everything else we do is a very temporary solution, and we might buy some time, which is a good thing, but we have to get to that. So these views, the more we are discussed, how we think is how we eventually act. And people don't often realize, people say, what does it have to do with worldview? Yeah, it has everything to do with worldview. So what we are discussing is a way of changing the worldview gradually, hopefully. You might go out to lunch today and mention it to a friend, and that friend will say, yeah, that's an interesting idea. So within a week, there may be 1,000 people, discussing some idea related to what we are discussing. And if more and more people, and I realized, some time ago, I realized that if you keep hearing the same thing over and over, it's our nature to start believing in it. So
American political campaigns.
Right. You just hear from every channel. So we can do the same thing, we can keep talking about love and peace and truth and the science of God in everything. And hopefully our worldview will change. At least, we can do our part. Yes, thank you.
How does this tie into what you're doing at the research
Huh.
center?
Rumi Research Center.
Privilege in all this too, because I just realized this morning that I'm going to be part of a religious leaders group visiting Turkey. We're going to be in your city on the 11th of October.
Which group?
And we're going to a museum.
Are you going with Kamarul?
We should be going to this-
Who are you going with? Who's your leader?
Bud Friend Jones. It's a group.
Huh. Well, you can visit us. When are you going? Let's talk about it after.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, we can.
Okay. Actually, the director of our center, Dr. Shadi Aidian, is there. We can discuss.
Wow.
Yeah. There, Dr. Shadi Aidian, there. Right. Yes. Anyway, so any more question? I'll be happy to answer any question.
I'd like to ask one question because this is what all the Facebook people are looking for. You said that there is an absolute, God is the only absolute.
Yeah.
It's not religion. And in the end, we don't need religion. Is that what it?
Yeah,
Okay, so from that, on that foundation, question, then they, like that, we all seek, the Bible says in the Revelation that in the New Jerusalem in heaven, there is no temples in there, and God's light, God's love is the only guiding light in people's lives. And when I see this is very the same concept here.
Right.
And but in order to achieve that kind of it is a tall order for human beings to achieve such a height that we can connect with God, and that's what we seek. But it's very difficult to actualize in their life. So many people give up as, oh, that's a utopian and idealistic ideas. But I wonder in Rumi's Rumi tradition, how do you help people to achieve such
Well, we all have to begin wherever we are. You know, there is no quick solution, not like some antibiotic and you get over whatever you're suffering now. And I think one of the fundamental principles that Rumi and all the teachers speak about, I want to put out a quote which I forgot to talk about. Wisdom is the lost camel of the believer. He has a right to it wherever he may find it. So we can learn from different traditions, you know. Like I was saying, what was I saying?
How does your vision help people?
Yeah. Well, this one of the fundamental principles Rumi teaches is whatever you put your mind and heart and mind in, you're going to be more and more like that. So if you think of roses, you'll be like a rose garden. If you think of terrorists all day, your mind is going to be good. You know, if you deal with sick people all day, you know, mentally sick people, your mind is going to think. If you think of God, you are going to be nearer and nearer to God. So wherever you are, you can start there. You can't jump, but it's possible for God. I mean, anything is possible for God. Just like this environmental crisis, maybe there will be a sudden shift of consciousness, I don't know. But anything is possible, but the usual way is take one step, think, oh God, and you are one step closer, you know. Think of, this is it. I mean, and the company of the good, company of other seekers. It's difficult to do it all by yourself. Company of the good is good. Yes?
Is there room for atheists in this concept of...
Well, for Rumi, I would say nothing is without any purpose. However, in the 13th century, you could probably almost never come across an atheist. But let's say if he was here, what would you do? I think Rumi would say, well, this guy is a challenge for me. Is my faith so solid, you know, that I can withstand his skepticism? But he would not, go beat you up because you're a creation of God and God is trying to tell him or test him by your very existence. Like, oh, this guy doesn't believe in God, what do I do? This is a test from God, I would say. From his perspective, he would say that. But whatever he saw, he said, and other mystics said, they don't just speculate, they don't say it because the Prophet said it or the Quran says it. What they say is that they realize it as concretely as you see this glass. But it's just in science you can demonstrate. Here it is. But there you have to take a path, you have to walk on the path to know it in your heart. And what the mystic says is that the realization in the heart is more eternal than this thing, because this thing in time will vanish. Everything is perishing except the face of God, the Quran says. So, it is very concrete realization what they're talking about. It's nothing about religion being about belief and science is about proof. This is rubbish. Religion is also about reality. And if you walk the path, if you don't walk, you just say, oh, I'm going to look over this over the weekend. But if you want to be a doctor, you spend 8 years studying. This is not fair. You walk the path for a few hours, years, get rid of anger, hatred, envy, jealousy, greed, and pride, and then say, oh, Rumi is talking rubbish. Yeah. Yes?
Does your organization do podcasts or books, or where would one go to learn
There are books in this country about our organization, even our center.
Just more about the topic of the lecture.
Huh. You can read different books by Rumi, and we will produce more, and we'll come out more, talk about it. The goal of our research center is to promote his message in different ways, not just what is written, but how it applies to the problems of the modern world. So dialogue, environmental crisis, and so forth are key areas that we want to work on.
Do you want suggestions and book titles? Would that be useful?
Huh.
Do you have any
Well, yeah, I mean, of course, William Chittick's book, The Path of Love.
What was that story you mentioned? Novels or stories?
Which one? Elif Shafak's?
Yeah.
It's not considered, the greatest. It's a popular novel, but it's called Elif Shafak's Ashk, or I think 40 Days. It's called 40 Days of Love or something. You'll see. She's a popular Turkish writer, female Turkish writer. Well,
Seyyed Hossein Nasr's books. Which of those books would you recommend?
Well, Seyyed Hossein Nasr has a book of poetry. It's a small book, but he hasn't written a book on Rumi. But one of the greatest Rumi experts is also Anne-Marie Schimmel, and his book Triumphal Sun, The Triumphal Sun. I think it's the main book, and there are other ones. She's German, and she taught in Harvard for 20 years probably, and she also translated many of her verses. I think Chittick and Schimmel are good ways to go. There are a lot of Turkish, Persian authors, but that may not help you as much. More?
We have a few more minutes. We have time enough for one more question if anybody wants. Can I ask a question?
Yes, please, of course.
I think it's really one of the things that I think came up a lot in the discussion here is a result of people who read Rumi, and they come from the background where the modern world is sort of like there's organized religion and then there's sort of spirituality, and Rumi's transcendence of forms is seen as sort of you don't need organized religion. You can spiritual, sort of speaking to the spiritual realm. Is that like a dangerous reading of Rumi? If Rumi were here, would he want everybody to read his books, even if they came from that perspective? Would he think that his books would clarify their perspective?
I think, it's important to understand all these things case by case. It's difficult to generalize on this issue. I remember a story where Dr. Nasr was asked, Dr. Nasr, what about organized religion? Do you support organized religion? Do you like organized religion? Or something like that. And his answer was, do you think the only good religion is an unorganized religion? So yes, organized religions can be a problem at times, but that doesn't mean that it has nothing to offer or that it doesn't have a great deal to offer. So Rumi, for instance, definitely criticizes a lot of Muslims. He says, don't give salam, this peace be upon you. Don't give salam to everybody. Many of these are just man-eaters, They give you salam, but in their heart, it's a house of devil, So yeah, you have to be discriminatory. Just because outwardly someone looks pious and on the way to God doesn't mean inwardly it's the same thing happening. But the forms can be used. If it's properly used, then it can benefit you a great deal. But the forms can be also a trap and also a means of deceiving people. And he wants you to be aware of that, very aware of that. He says you can buy a busload of these false teachers for a penny, like that. Yes, there are a lot of fake ones, but there are a lot of fake people everywhere. And we have to be constantly applying La ilaha illallah, only truth, in every case. Otherwise, what's the value of wisdom? What is wisdom?
In the spiritual realm, there's a lot of mixing and matching. So I heard somebody describe themselves as an Episcopagan.
Thank you. This has been, I've attended lots of talks on Rumi, and this has been an extremely both accessible but also high-level presentation. So I'm
Thank you.
personally very grateful. And I think for those of you who don't know a lot about the subject, this has been a great introduction. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.